The coffee cup trembled in Sarah Chen's weathered hands as three men in leather jackets pushed through the glass door of Murphy's Diner, their eyes scanning the nearly empty restaurant like predators sizing up prey. The 62-year-old woman sitting alone in the corner booth didn't look up from her newspaper, her gray hair pulled back in a simple ponytail, reading glasses perched on her nose. To anyone watching, she appeared to be just another retired grandmother enjoying her morning coffee and scrambled eggs. The men's boots echoed against the checkered linoleum floor as they surveyed the diner's interior. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Besides Sarah, only 3 other people occupied the establishment, a young couple sharing pancakes near the window, and Jake Morrison, the 20-something server who was wiping down tables with nervous energy. The cook had stepped out for a smoke break, leaving the small staff vulnerable and exposed. Sarah's fingers tightened almost imperceptibly around her coffee mug as she observed the 3 men through her peripheral vision. 28 years of military service had taught her to assess threats without appearing to do so, and everything about these individuals screamed danger. The leader, a tall man with a spider web tattoo covering his neck, moved with the predatory confidence of someone accustomed to intimidating others. His companions flanked him like wolves, their hands positioned near concealed weapons beneath their jackets. The morning had started like any other for Sarah Chen, former Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, though none of the diner's regular customers knew about her military background. She had moved to the small town of Millbrook 3 years ago, seeking the anonymity and peace that came with civilian life after decades of service in some of the world's most dangerous places. Her modest ranch house on Elm Street gave no indication of the woman who lived there, no military memorabilia or service awards displayed for curious neighbors to see. Sarah had deliberately chosen this quiet existence, trading the adrenaline and purpose of military life for the simple routine of morning coffee at Murphy's Diner, afternoon walks through Millbrook's tree-lined streets, and evenings spent reading in her favorite armchair. She had earned this peaceful retirement after serving her country with distinction, but she had also learned that some skills never truly fade, no matter how desperately you might want them to. The young couple near the window remained oblivious to the tension that had entered their sanctuary, lost in their own conversation about weekend plans and upcoming exams. Jake continued his nervous cleaning, glancing occasionally at the 3 newcomers who had positioned themselves strategically throughout the diner. The leader had taken a seat at the counter where he could observe the entire restaurant, while his companions blocked the 2 exits with casual efficiency. Sarah's training kicked in automatically as she analyzed the tactical situation developing around her. The men were professionals, not random troublemakers looking for a quick score. Their positioning was too deliberate, their movements too coordinated for amateurs. She recognized the signs of military or law enforcement training in their bearing, which made them infinitely more dangerous than typical criminals. The spider-tattooed leader's eyes settled on Sarah's table, and she felt the familiar chill of being evaluated as a potential threat or witness. She deliberately hunched her shoulders slightly, letting her newspaper shake in her hands as if she were nervous about the strange men who had entered her peaceful refuge. The performance was flawless, decades of experience teaching her exactly how to appear harmless and forgettable. Jake approached the counter with his practiced customer service smile, though Sarah could see the uncertainty in his young eyes. The kid was maybe 22, working his way through community college with shifts at the diner and weekend jobs at the hardware store. He had the soft look of someone who had never faced real violence, never been tested by circumstances that revealed what a person was truly made of. "Welcome to Murphy's," Jake said, his voice carrying just a slight tremor that Sarah's trained ear immediately detected. "What can I get started for you folks this morning?" The leader smiled, but it was the cold expression of a shark showing its teeth. "Coffee, black, and maybe you can help us with something else." His voice carried the rough edges of someone who had spent time in correctional facilities, each word carefully measured and deliberate. Sarah adjusted her reading glasses and turned a page of her newspaper, the picture of an elderly woman absorbed in the morning news. Beneath the table, however, her muscles had shifted into a state of readiness that she hadn't experienced in 3 years. Her breathing had automatically adjusted to the controlled rhythm that had served her through countless dangerous situations, her heart rate dropping to the steady pace that preceded action. The tactical assessment continued as Sarah cataloged every detail of her surroundings. The diner's layout was simple but provided both advantages and disadvantages. The large windows offered excellent visibility, but also made the interior vulnerable to outside observation. The kitchen door led to a rear exit, but it was currently blocked by one of the intruders. The restroom hallway provided potential cover but could easily become a trap. Murphy's Diner had been Sarah's regular morning stop for 3 years, long enough for her to know every sightline, every potential piece of cover, every possible escape route. She had unconsciously chosen this particular booth because it provided optimal observation angles while keeping her back protected against the wall. Old habits died hard, even in retirement. The young couple finally seemed to sense that something was wrong, their conversation trailing off, as they noticed the 3 men who had transformed their romantic breakfast into something much more sinister. The woman, a blonde college student named Amy, whom Sarah recognized from previous visits, moved closer to her boyfriend with the instinctive fear of prey animals sensing approaching predators. Jake set down a coffee cup with hands that were now visibly shaking, the ceramic rattling against the saucer in a way that made the leader's smile grow wider. The sound seemed unnaturally loud in the suddenly quiet diner, broken only by the soft jazz music playing from speakers that now seemed inappropriate for the tension filling the air. "You seem nervous, kid," the leader observed, his tone conversational but carrying an underlying threat that made Jake step back involuntarily. "Is there something you want to tell us about the morning deposits, about what time your manager usually makes the bank run?" Sarah's newspaper lowered slightly as she processed this information. These weren't random criminals or opportunistic thieves. They had done their homework, studied the diner's routines, planned their approach with military precision. The robbery was carefully orchestrated, timed to coincide with the morning deposit when the restaurant's cash register would be at its fullest. The realization that she was witnessing a professional operation changed Sarah's calculations entirely. Amateur criminals might be satisfied with the day's take and leave without unnecessary violence, but professionals often eliminated witnesses as a matter of course. The 3 men hadn't bothered to conceal their faces or identities, which suggested they weren't planning to leave anyone capable of providing descriptions to law enforcement. Sarah's fingers found the cell phone in her purse, but a quick glance at the screen confirmed her suspicions. No signal. One of the men had undoubtedly deployed a jamming device, cutting off the diner's communication with the outside world. The isolation was complete, turning Murphy's into a killing ground where whatever happened would remain hidden until someone discovered the aftermath. The leader's attention returned to Sarah's table and she felt his gaze like a physical weight pressing against her carefully constructed facade. She forced her hands to continue trembling as she lifted her coffee cup, playing the role of a frightened elderly woman who posed no threat to their operation. The performance had to be perfect because her life and the lives of the other innocent people in the diner depended on maintaining the illusion of helplessness. Years of classified operations had taught Sarah that survival often depended on being underestimated by your enemies. She had used her unassuming appearance and seemingly harmless demeanor to get close to targets who never suspected that death was sharing their table. The skills that had made her one of the military's most effective operatives were about to be tested in a civilian setting where the stakes were equally high. Jake's hands shook as he reached for the coffee pot, the young man's fear becoming more pronounced with each passing second. Sarah could see him calculating his chances of escape, his eyes darting toward the kitchen door that was blocked by one of the intruders. The kid was brave but untrained, more likely to get himself and others killed if he attempted heroics without proper preparation. The couple near the window had stopped pretending to eat, their breakfast growing cold as they huddled together in obvious terror. Amy's boyfriend, a stocky young man named Derek, who worked at the local garage, was trying to project strength and protection, but Sarah could see the uncertainty in his posture. He was weighing the same impossible choices that faced every civilian caught in a life-threatening situation. The leader stood up from his stool with deliberate slowness, his height and bulk becoming more intimidating as he moved toward Jake with predatory intent. "Let me ask you again, kid, when does your manager make the bank run? And before you think about lying to me, understand that I already know the answer. I'm just testing whether you're smart enough to stay alive." Sarah's military mind automatically began calculating angles, distances, and timing. The leader was approximately 6 feet 4 inches tall, probably weighing around 230 pounds with the solid build of someone who maintained his physical condition through regular exercise. His companions were smaller but moved with the fluid coordination of trained fighters, their positioning professional enough to suggest military or law enforcement backgrounds. The tactical situation was challenging but not impossible. Sarah's years of experience had taught her that superior positioning and surprise could overcome significant disadvantages in numbers and firepower. The key was waiting for the right moment, when the targets were distracted and vulnerable, then striking with overwhelming speed and precision. Jake's voice cracked as he answered the leader's question. Mr. Murphy usually goes to the bank around 10:30, right after the breakfast rush dies down. He takes yesterday's receipts and today's early sales, the information spilled out of him like water from a broken dam, fear overriding any thought of resistance or deception. The leader nodded with satisfaction, checking his watch with the casual air of someone whose plan was proceeding exactly as expected. That gives us about 90 minutes to get comfortable, plenty of time to make sure everyone understands how this is going to work. Sarah lowered her newspaper completely now, allowing her face to show the appropriate level of fear and confusion that any normal civilian would experience in this situation. Her performance had to convince not only the criminals but also the other victims that she was nothing more than an unfortunate bystander caught up in events beyond her control. The years since Sarah's retirement had been filled with the ordinary challenges of civilian life, learning to navigate grocery stores without tactical awareness, sleeping through the night without checking perimeter security, interacting with neighbors who had never faced anything more dangerous than a flat tire or a power outage. She had worked hard to leave her military identity behind, to become just another anonymous retiree in a small town where nothing ever happened. But those years of forced normalcy had done nothing to diminish the skills that had been burned into her muscle memory through decades of training and combat experience. Her body still moved with the controlled efficiency of a professional soldier, her mind still processed threats and opportunities with the speed and accuracy that had kept her alive in places where hesitation meant death. The transformation from harmless civilian to lethal operative would take less than 3 seconds when the moment came. Sarah had practiced the transition countless times during her active service, training her body to switch between personas as easily as changing clothes. The ability to appear helpless while remaining deadly was perhaps the most valuable skill she had ever developed. Amy's soft sobbing cut through the tension in the diner, as the reality of their situation became impossible to ignore. Her boyfriend wrapped his arms around her protectively, whispering reassurances that sounded hollow in the face of their obvious peril. The young couple represented everything that Sarah had fought to protect during her military career: innocent people living their lives in freedom, unaware of the constant threats that existed just beyond their peaceful existence. The leader's attention shifted to the young couple, his predatory smile widening as he observed their fear. "Now there's no need for tears, sweetheart. If everyone stays calm and follows instructions, this will all be over soon."
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
His words were meant to sound reassuring, but the underlying menace was unmistakable to anyone with experience reading human predators. Sarah's tactical assessment continued as she observed the leader's interaction with the couple. He was enjoying their fear, taking pleasure in the power he held over their lives. This psychological profile suggested someone who might escalate the violence beyond what was necessary for the robbery, someone who saw victims as entertainment rather than simply obstacles to overcome. The criminal's enjoyment of fear was both a weakness and a danger. It meant he might become distracted by the psychological games he played with his victims, creating opportunities for counterattack. But it also meant he was more likely to hurt innocent people for his own gratification, raising the stakes considerably for any intervention Sarah might attempt. One of the leader's companions, a wiry man with prison tattoos covering his forearms, moved toward the kitchen door with practiced efficiency. Sarah heard the sound of the rear exit being secured, probably with a chair wedged under the door handle. The criminals were sealing the diner systematically, ensuring that no one could escape and no unexpected visitors could enter during their operation. The second companion, a heavy-set man with the scarred knuckles of someone who had spent considerable time fighting, positioned himself near the front entrance where he could observe the parking lot and street. His stance suggested military training, feet properly positioned for quick movement, weight balanced to allow rapid response to threats from any direction. Sarah adjusted her reading glasses again, using the motion to survey the diner's interior one final time. The criminals had positioned themselves well, controlling all avenues of escape while maintaining clear fields of fire throughout the restaurant. Their tactical deployment was professional enough to suggest extensive planning and possibly insider information about the diner's layout and daily routines. The kitchen timer chose that moment to ring, its cheerful chiming sound creating a surreal contrast to the deadly serious situation developing in the dining room. Jake flinched at the noise, his nerves stretched to the breaking point by the sustained tension. The leader laughed at the young man's reaction, clearly enjoying the psychological pressure he was applying to his victims. "Relax, kid, it's just breakfast getting ready." The leader's voice carried mock sympathy that made his cruelty even more apparent. Though I have to say I'm disappointed in the service here. Usually when I visit a restaurant I expect a little more hospitality. Sarah found herself thinking about the life she had built in Millbrook over the past 3 years. The quiet mornings at Murphy's Diner had become a cherished routine, a symbol of the peaceful existence she had earned through decades of service in places where peace was a luxury few could afford. She had grown fond of Jake's eager attempts to remember every customer's preferences, Amy and Derek's young love that reminded her of her own youth, even Murphy's gruff but kindly presence behind the grill. The thought of these innocent people being hurt or killed because she had chosen this particular diner as her refuge was unacceptable. Sarah had spent her entire military career protecting people who couldn't protect themselves, and retirement hadn't changed her fundamental nature. She was still a guardian, still someone who stood between predators and their prey. The leader checked his watch again, his impatience becoming more apparent as the minutes ticked by. Murphy should be getting here soon to start prepping for the lunch crowd. When he arrives we'll have our little chat about the safe combination and this morning's deposit. His tone suggested that Murphy's cooperation was not really a request but an inevitable result of applied pressure. Sarah knew Murphy Castellano from 3 years of morning conversations about everything from baseball scores to local politics. The 60-year-old restaurant owner was a former Marine himself, though his service had been during peacetime in the late 70s. He was tough and stubborn, exactly the kind of man who might try to resist armed criminals rather than simply hand over his money. The thought of Murphy walking into this trap unprepared was another factor Sarah had to consider in her tactical planning. The restaurant owner would almost certainly attempt to fight back when confronted with threats to his customers and employees, but his military experience was decades old and purely peacetime training. He would be brave but outmatched, likely getting himself and others killed in a heroic but futile gesture. Jake's hands had steadied slightly as he busied himself with unnecessary cleaning tasks, trying to maintain some sense of normalcy in an increasingly abnormal situation. Sarah recognized the coping mechanism from her own experience with civilians caught in combat zones. People often focused on routine tasks as a way of denying the reality of mortal danger surrounding them. The young server's efforts to appear busy were actually helping Sarah's own deception by drawing attention away from her table. She used his movement as cover to shift her position slightly, adjusting her angle to provide better lines of sight to all 3 targets while maintaining her facade of harmless elderly confusion. Amy's crying had subsided into quiet sniffles as Derek continued his whispered reassurances, though both young people remained obviously terrified. Their youth and inexperience made them particularly vulnerable to the psychological tactics the criminals were employing, but it also meant they were less likely to attempt resistance that might trigger violence. The leader's entertainment was clearly focused on prolonging the fear and uncertainty rather than quickly completing the robbery and leaving. This sadistic tendency was consistent with someone who had spent time in prison, where psychological dominance often meant the difference between survival and victimization. He was applying the same principles here, establishing his control over the situation through sustained intimidation. Sarah's assessment of the 3 criminals had crystallized into clear tactical profiles. The leader was physically dangerous but potentially distracted by his enjoyment of psychological games. The wiry companion was disciplined and focused, probably the most tactically sound of the 3. The heavy-set lookout was strong and trained but positioned away from the main action, making him a secondary threat in any immediate confrontation. The sound of a car door slamming in the parking lot caused everyone in the diner to freeze momentarily. Through the window Sarah could see Murphy's familiar blue pickup truck, the restaurant owner himself walking toward the entrance with his usual purposeful stride. The trap was about to be completed, adding another innocent life to the equation Sarah would have to balance in any action she might take. Murphy pushed through the front door with his characteristic energy, already calling out his morning greeting to Jake before he noticed the 3 strangers occupying his restaurant. The older man's Marine training was evident in his immediate assessment of the situation, his posture shifting automatically into a more alert stance as he recognized the threat facing his employees and customers. "Morning, Jake. Looks like we've got some early visitors today." Murphy's voice was carefully controlled, but Sarah could hear the edge of steel that suggested the restaurant owner was preparing himself for whatever was about to happen. His military bearing was obvious to anyone with experience recognizing such things, including the 3 criminals who immediately identified him as a potential threat. The leader stood up from his stool with predatory grace, his full attention now focused on the new arrival who represented both the final piece of his plan and the greatest potential obstacle to its success. "You must be Murphy. We've been waiting for you. Why don't you come join us for a little conversation about banking procedures and safe combinations? Sarah watched the confrontation develop with the analytical detachment of a professional soldier, her mind already calculating the optimal timing for intervention. The moment was approaching when her careful facade would have to be abandoned in favor of direct action. 3 years of peaceful retirement were about to end in the next few minutes, and Sarah Chen was about to remember exactly why she had been one of the military's most effective and feared operatives. Murphy's weathered hands remained steady as he assessed the 3 men who had transformed his peaceful diner into a battleground. Sarah observed the restaurant owner's reaction with professional interest, noting how his decades-old Marine training manifested in subtle ways that civilians wouldn't recognize but that marked him as potentially dangerous to the criminals who were studying him with equal intent. The Murphy's weathered hands remained steady as he assessed the 3 men who had transformed his peaceful diner into a battleground. The leader's smile faltered slightly as he registered Murphy's controlled response to the threat. Most civilians would have shown immediate fear or confusion when confronted with armed criminals, but Murphy's calm demeanor suggested someone who had faced danger before and wasn't easily intimidated. The criminal's psychological advantage was diminishing with each second that passed without the expected display of terror from his newest victim. "I asked you a question, old man," the leader said, his voice carrying more edge now as he attempted to reassert his dominance over the situation. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way, but either way you're going to open that safe and hand over the morning deposit." Murphy's response was measured and deliberate, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone accustomed to command. "I don't keep much cash on the premises overnight. Whatever you're looking for, it's probably not worth the trouble you're creating for yourselves." The restaurant owner was buying time while he assessed his options, but Sarah could see that his tactical situation was hopeless without assistance. Sarah's fingers tightened imperceptibly around her coffee cup as she watched the confrontation escalate. The leader was becoming frustrated with Murphy's lack of cooperation, and frustrated criminals were dangerous criminals. She had seen enough interrogations during her military career to recognize the warning signs that preceded violence, and all of them were present in the leader's increasingly aggressive body language. The wiry criminal near the kitchen door shifted his weight in a way that Sarah's trained eye immediately recognized as preparation for action. His hand moved closer to the weapon concealed beneath his jacket, and his stance indicated readiness to draw and fire at a moment's notice. The professional's patience was wearing thin, and he was preparing to escalate the situation beyond me. Jake had stopped his nervous cleaning and was now standing frozen behind the counter, his young face pale with terror as he watched his employer face down 3 armed men. The server's inexperience with violence was evident in his wide-eyed stare and rapid breathing, but Sarah could also see a spark of loyalty that might drive him to attempt something foolishly heroic if Murphy was threatened. Amy's quiet sobbing had resumed as the tension in the diner reached a breaking point. Her boyfriend Derek wrapped his arms around her more tightly, whispering reassurances that rang hollow in the face of their obvious peril. The young couple represented the kind of innocent civilians that Sarah had spent her career protecting, and their fear served as a constant reminder of what was at stake. The heavy-set lookout near the front door maintained his professional vigilance, occasionally glancing out at the parking lot to ensure their operation remained undetected. His discipline was impressive, resisting the natural urge to watch the confrontation developing behind him in favor of maintaining security for the group. Sarah made note of his positioning and field of view, information that would be crucial when the time came for action. Murphy took a step closer to the leader, a movement that caused all 3 criminals to tense visibly. "Look, son, I've got employees and customers here who don't deserve to be caught up in whatever problems you're trying to solve with my money. Why don't we step into the office and discuss this privately?" The leader's laugh was harsh and without humor. "Nice try, Marine. Yeah, I can tell what you used to be. But your glory days are over, and right now you're just an old man with a cash register full of money that belongs to me." The criminal's identification of Murphy's military background was concerning, suggesting more thorough surveillance than Sarah had initially assumed. Sarah's mind raced through tactical scenarios as she observed the deteriorating situation. Murphy's attempt to isolate the confrontation was tactically sound but unlikely to succeed given the criminal's obvious experience in planning. The restaurant owner was trying to protect his people, but he was outnumbered and outgunned by professionals who held every advantage except surprise. The element of surprise belonged entirely to Sarah, though she knew that using it effectively would require perfect timing and flawless execution. Once she revealed her true capabilities, the situation would explode into violence with no possibility of retreat or negotiation. Every move from that point forward would be committed, with life and death hanging in the balance of split-second decisions. The leader reached into his jacket with deliberate slowness, his eyes never leaving Murphy's face as he withdrew a pistol that gleamed dully in the diner's fluorescent lighting. The weapon was a professional's tool, well maintained and equipped with a suppressor that would muffle the sound of gunfire. The sight of the gun caused Jake to gasp audibly and Amy to begin crying harder, their civilian minds struggling to process the reality of imminent violence.
"Let me make this simple for everyone," the leader announced, his voice carrying the calm confidence of someone who had crossed the line from threats to action. "Murphy opens the safe and gives us the money. Everyone stays quiet and cooperative, and maybe we all walk out of here without any permanent damage." Sarah's assessment of the leader crystallized as she watched him handle the weapon. His grip was professional, finger properly positioned alongside the trigger guard rather than on the trigger itself. His stance indicated formal training, probably military or law enforcement background that had been corrupted by time in the criminal justice system. He was dangerous precisely because he combined professional skills with predatory instincts. The tactical situation was approaching the point of no return, where words would give way to violence and innocent people would start dying. Sarah's 3 years of peaceful retirement had given her perspective on the value of the quiet life she had built, but they had also clarified her understanding of what she was willing to sacrifice to protect it. Murphy's hands remained steady as he faced the armed criminal, his Marine training evident in his refusal to show fear despite the obvious disparity in their tactical positions. "The safe's on a time lock, won't open until 10:30, same time I usually make the bank run. You're welcome to wait, but that's 45 minutes for someone to notice what's happening here." The leader's expression darkened at this information, his plan clearly disrupted by the unexpected delay. Sarah could see him calculating the risks of extending their operation, weighing the potential reward against the increasing danger of discovery. Frustrated criminals made poor decisions, and poor decisions created opportunities for those patient enough to exploit them. "You're lying," the wiry criminal near the kitchen door interjected, his voice carrying the sharp edge of someone whose patience had run out. "No diner keeps that kind of money in a time-locked safe. You're stalling, hoping someone comes to rescue you." Murphy's slight smile held no warmth as he responded to the accusation. "Believe what you want, but I've been robbed twice in the 15 years I've owned this place. The insurance company insisted on the time lock after the second incident. You can shoot me if you want, but that safe won't open until the timer says it will." Sarah found herself admiring Murphy's tactical thinking even as she recognized the dangerous game he was playing. The restaurant owner was using the criminals' greed against them, creating a situation where they would have to choose between abandoning their primary objective or accepting an extended operation with all its attendant risks. It was a brave strategy, but one that could easily backfire if the criminals decided to cut their losses violently. The leader's frustration was becoming more apparent with each passing second. His carefully planned operation was unraveling due to a security measure he hadn't anticipated, and his options were narrowing rapidly. Sarah could see him struggling with the decision that would determine whether this remained a robbery or escalated into something much worse. Jake's movement behind the counter caught everyone's attention as the young server reached for something below the cash register. The motion was innocent enough, probably an attempt to retrieve a towel or cleaning supplies, but in the charged atmosphere of the diner it triggered an immediate and violent response from the wiry criminal. "Hands where I can see them." The criminal's shout was accompanied by the distinctive sound of a weapon being drawn, the metallic slide of steel against leather that every combat veteran recognized instantly. Jake's hands shot up immediately, but the damage was done. The situation had escalated beyond threats to active weapon deployment. Sarah's body tensed automatically as her military training assessed the new threat level. The criminal's weapon was now visible, a compact pistol held in a professional grip that indicated serious intent to use it. The safety protocols that had governed the confrontation were breaking down rapidly, replaced by the immediate possibility of gunfire in a confined space filled with innocent civilians. The heavy-set lookout had turned from his position near the door, adding his own weapon to the tactical equation. 2 guns were now drawn and aimed, transforming the diner from a place of business into a potential killing ground. Sarah calculated angles and distances, her mind automatically plotting movement patterns and target priorities even as she maintained her facade of terrified civilian. Amy's screaming cut through the tension like a knife, her terror finally overcoming the shock that had kept her quiet. Derek tried to calm her while simultaneously shielding her body with his own, the young man's protective instincts overriding his fear. Their obvious panic was infectious, adding another layer of chaos to an already unstable situation. "Everybody calm down," the leader shouted, but his own agitation was evident in his voice.
The operation was spiraling out of control, and he was struggling to maintain command of his men and the situation. Professional criminals preferred predictability and control, and both were rapidly disappearing from the scenario. Murphy remained the calmest person in the room besides Sarah, his military experience, serving him well in the face of multiple weapons. Nobody needs to get hurt here. Let the kids go and we can work out whatever arrangement you need. They're not part of this. The leader's response was swift and brutal, using the butt of his pistol to strike Murphy across the temple in a blow calculated to stun rather than kill. The restaurant owner staggered but remained standing, blood trickling down his face from the impact. The violence served its intended purpose of demonstrating the criminal's willingness to hurt people while stopping short of permanent damage. Sarah's hands clenched into fists beneath the table as she watched the assault on Murphy, her carefully maintained composure threatened by the sight of an honorable man being brutalized by predators. The blow had been delivered with professional efficiency, designed to inflict pain and assert dominance without causing serious injury that might complicate their escape. Jake's horrified gasp at seeing his employer attacked was audible across the diner, the young man's shock evident in his pale face and trembling hands. The server was learning harsh lessons about the reality of violence, discovering that the movies and television shows he had grown up watching bore little resemblance to the ugly reality of armed criminals brutalizing innocent people. The wiry criminal kept his weapon trained on Jake while scanning the rest of the diner for potential threats. His professional paranoia was evident in the systematic way he checked corners and sightlines, ensuring that no one could approach his position without being detected. Sarah noted his methodology, filing the information away for future reference. "That was just a love tap," the leader announced, his voice carrying mock sympathy as he studied Murphy's bloodied face. "The next one won't be so gentle. Now I'm going to ask you one more time about that safe combination, and I want you to think real carefully about your answer." Murphy wiped blood from his eyes with the back of his hand, his Marine pride evident in his refusal to show weakness despite the pain he was undoubtedly experiencing. "I told you the truth about the time lock, but there's maybe $300 in the register from this morning's breakfast crowd. Take it and leave these people alone." The leader's patience finally snapped completely at Murphy's continued defiance. "You think this is a negotiation? You think you have something to say about how this goes?" His voice rose with each word, the professional facade cracking to reveal the violent predator beneath. Sarah knew that the situation was about to cross the line from assault to something much worse. The leader's psychological profile indicated someone who would escalate violence when faced with continued resistance, and Murphy's refusal to be intimidated was pushing all the wrong buttons. The next few seconds would determine whether anyone walked out of the diner alive. The sound of another vehicle pulling into the parking lot caused everyone to freeze momentarily. Through the window, Sarah could see a police cruiser probably making a routine stop for coffee that had become anything but routine. The arrival of law enforcement changed every calculation in the room, transforming a robbery into a potential hostage situation with exponentially higher stakes. Officer Jennifer Walsh stepped out of her patrol car with the casual confidence of someone making a routine stop at a familiar location. Sarah recognized the young policewoman from previous visits to the diner, knowing her to be competent but inexperienced with serious violence. Walsh was walking into a trap that would almost certainly result in her death unless someone intervened immediately. The leader's reaction was swift and decisive, his criminal experience taking over as he gestured for his companions to take positions covering the entrance. "Looks like we've got company. Everyone stays calm and plays their part, or the cop dies first and we work our way through the rest of you." Sarah's decision crystallized in that instant as she watched Officer Walsh approach the diner's entrance, unaware of the deadly situation awaiting her inside. 3 years of peaceful retirement ended as Sarah Chen, former staff sergeant and decorated sniper, prepared to return to the profession she had never truly left behind. The transition from harmless civilian to lethal operative began with a subtle shift in Sarah's posture, muscles moving into positions that would allow explosive action when the moment came. Her breathing deepened automatically, feeding oxygen to muscles that would soon demand maximum performance. The facade that had protected her for 3 years was about to be abandoned in favor of skills that had made her one of the military's most effective killers. Officer Walsh pushed through the front door with her usual friendly greeting, completely unaware that she was walking into a carefully orchestrated trap. "Morning everyone, Murphy, the usual coffee to go when you get a chance." Her casual words seemed to echo strangely in the charged atmosphere of the diner, innocence colliding with calculated violence.
The heavy-set criminal near the door moved with practiced efficiency, positioning himself behind Walsh before she could fully assess the situation. His weapon pressed against her spine just below her body armor, placed precisely where it would cause maximum damage while remaining concealed from anyone outside the diner. "Don't move, don't speak, don't even breathe loud," he whispered in Walsh's ear, his voice carrying the calm professionalism of someone who had done this before. "Your radio, your weapon, everything on your belt. Nice and slow, or everyone in here dies," starting with the old lady in the corner. Sarah felt the criminal's eyes on her as he used her apparent helplessness as leverage against the police officer, not realizing that he had just made the gravest tactical error of his criminal career. The reference to her as a harmless elderly woman would have been amusing under different circumstances, but now it simply confirmed that her cover remained intact even as she prepared to destroy it completely. Walsh's training kicked in as she processed the reality of her situation, her hand moving slowly toward her service weapon despite the gun pressed against her back. The young officer was brave but inexperienced, about to make a move that would get everyone in the diner killed unless Sarah acted first. The moment had arrived. 3 years of peaceful retirement were about to end in a display of violence that would remind everyone present why some people should never be underestimated, regardless of their age or appearance. Sarah Chen was about to teach 3 professional criminals the difference between predators and apex predators. The coffee cup in Sarah's hand stopped trembling. The transformation happened in less than 2 seconds. Sarah's trembling hands became steel steady as she set down her coffee cup with deliberate precision, her entire demeanor shifting from frightened elderly woman to something far more dangerous.
The change was so subtle that the criminals missed it entirely, their attention focused on controlling Officer Walsh and maintaining their positions throughout the diner. Sarah's first move was almost imperceptible, a slight adjustment of her position that gave her better angles to all 3 targets while maintaining the appearance of cowering in her corner booth. Her right hand slipped beneath the table to her purse, fingers finding the compact Glock 19 that had been her constant companion since leaving military service. The weapon felt familiar in her grip, muscle memory taking over after 3 years of peaceful concealment. The wiry criminal near the kitchen door was calculating distances and response times, his professional paranoia serving him well as he monitored both the new police officer and the existing hostages. His positioning was tactically sound but suffered from a crucial flaw: he had dismissed Sarah as a non-threat, allowing her to occupy dead space in his security assessment. The mistake would cost him everything. Officer Walsh's hand froze halfway to her service weapon as the heavy-set criminal's gun pressed harder against her spine, the reality of her situation becoming undeniably clear. Her training had prepared her for traffic stops gone wrong and domestic disputes, but not for walking into an organized robbery with multiple armed suspects and civilian hostages. The young policewoman was learning that real violence bore little resemblance to the controlled scenarios of police academy training. The leader's attention remained focused on Murphy, whose bloodied face and defiant posture continued to challenge the criminal's authority over the situation. The restaurant owner's refusal to be intimidated was admirable but dangerous, pushing an already unstable predator toward the kind of explosive violence that left no survivors. Sarah could see the psychological dynamics playing out, recognizing the signs of impending escalation that she had witnessed in combat zones around the world. Jake pressed himself against the back wall behind the counter, his young mind struggling to process the transformation of his workplace into a scene from his worst nightmares. The server's innocence was being shattered by exposure to the kind of calculated brutality that most civilians never encountered outside of movies and television. His wide eyes and rapid breathing indicated the onset of shock, a natural response to witnessing violence that threatened to overwhelm his ability to function. Amy's terror had reached the point where she could no longer make coherent sounds, her voice reduced to quiet whimpering as Derek tried desperately to shield her from the escalating horror around them. The young couple's predicament represented everything that Sarah had spent her military career fighting against: innocent people caught in the crossfire of forces beyond their control or understanding. The leader raised his weapon toward Murphy's head with deliberate slowness, the gesture designed to maximize psychological impact on everyone watching. "I'm done playing games with you, Marine. Last chance to open that safe before I start putting holes in people who matter to you." His voice carried the cold certainty of someone who had crossed lines that could never be uncrossed. Sarah's tactical analysis reached its conclusion as she watched the leader prepare to execute Murphy in front of his employees and customers. The criminal's position near the center of the diner gave him command of the space but also made him vulnerable to attack from multiple angles. His companions were well positioned but focused on their assigned sectors, creating blind spots that a skilled operator could exploit. The moment of decision arrived as Sarah saw the leader's finger begin to tighten on his trigger, the subtle motion that preceded firing in less than a second. Murphy's life hung in the balance of Sarah's split-second choice between maintaining her cover and revealing capabilities that would transform her from observer to participant in the violence that was about to consume the diner. Sarah moved with the fluid precision of someone who had performed similar actions thousands of times in training and dozens of times in actual combat. Her right hand brought the Glock up from beneath the table while her left swept her reading glasses aside, clearing her field of vision for the shots that would follow. The motion was so smooth and practiced that it seemed almost casual, belying the lethal intent behind every movement. The leader never saw the threat coming. His attention remained fixed on Murphy even as Sarah's first shot took him center mass, the suppressed pistol's quiet report lost in the general chaos of the moment. The bullet struck with surgical precision, penetrating vital organs and dropping the criminal instantly. His own weapon discharged harmlessly into the ceiling as his nervous system shut down, the sound echoing through the diner like thunder. The wiry criminal near the kitchen door began to turn toward the unexpected gunfire, his professional instincts recognizing the distinctive sound of suppressed gunfire and the immediate threat it represented. His reaction time was impressive, weapon coming around in a smooth arc that would have made him dangerous if he had been facing anyone less skilled than Sarah Chen. Sarah's second shot caught the turning criminal in the upper chest before he could complete his pivot, the bullet's impact spinning him around and sending his weapon clattering across the floor. The precision of the shot was extraordinary, placing the bullet exactly where it would cause maximum damage while avoiding ricochets that might endanger the civilian hostages scattered throughout the diner. The heavy-set criminal behind Officer Walsh reacted with admirable speed, pushing the policewoman aside while bringing his own weapon to bear on Sarah's position. His movement was tactically sound, using Walsh's body as temporary cover while he assessed the new threat and prepared his response. The criminal's training was evident in his controlled motion and proper weapon handling, marking him as genuinely dangerous. Sarah's third shot came as she rolled from her booth toward better cover behind the counter, the movement flowing seamlessly from her shooting position. The bullet caught the heavy-set criminal in the shoulder, spinning him around and destroying his ability to aim effectively. The shot was deliberately non-fatal, designed to neutralize the threat while preserving his life for the questioning that would follow. Officer Walsh hit the floor as the criminal released her, her police training finally asserting itself as she drew her service weapon and sought cover behind an overturned table. The young policewoman's movements were mechanical but effective, muscle memory taking over when conscious thought was overwhelmed by the sudden explosion of violence around her. The entire engagement lasted less than 8 seconds from Sarah's first shot to the neutralization of all three threats. The precision and speed of her response left no doubt about her professional background, though the specific nature of her training remained unclear to the stunned witnesses. She had moved with the deadly efficiency of someone for whom violence was not an emergency but a practiced skill. Murphy stared at Sarah with newfound understanding, his Marine experience allowing him to recognize the quality of shooting he had just witnessed. The restaurant owner's assessment of the elderly woman in the corner booth underwent radical revision as he processed the evidence of her capabilities. Sarah's performance had been that of an elite operator, someone with extensive combat experience and specialized training. Jake emerged from behind the counter with shaking hands, his civilian mind struggling to comprehend what had just happened in his familiar workplace. The young server looked at Sarah with something approaching awe, unable to reconcile the harmless grandmother he had served coffee to for 3 years with the lethal operative who had just saved all their lives. Amy and Derek remained huddled together near the window, their terror now mixed with confusion as they tried to understand how the situation had reversed so dramatically. The young couple's worldview was being fundamentally altered by exposure to realities they had never imagined, learning that danger and salvation could both come from the most unexpected sources. Sarah maintained her shooting position behind the counter, weapon trained on the wounded criminal while her eyes swept the diner for additional threats. Her breathing remained controlled and steady, showing none of the adrenaline rush that affected everyone else in the room. The transition from peaceful retiree to combat operative was complete, revealing the professional soldier who had never truly left military service behind. The heavy-set criminal groaned from his position on the floor, clutching his wounded shoulder while his weapon lay well beyond reach. Sarah's shot placement had been precise enough to disable without killing, demonstrating the kind of surgical accuracy that came from years of training and real-world application. The criminal's survival was intentional, ensuring that law enforcement would have someone to question about the robbery's planning and execution. Officer Walsh rose from behind her improvised cover with her service weapon drawn, though she kept it pointed toward the floor rather than at Sarah. The policewoman's training told her that Sarah represented a potential threat, but her instincts recognized the elderly woman as the person who had just saved her life. The contradiction created uncertainty that was evident in Walsh's hesitant movements and confused expression. "Ma'am, I need you to put down your weapon," Walsh said, though her voice lacked conviction. The standard police procedure conflicted with the obvious reality that Sarah had acted to protect everyone in the diner, creating a situation that the young officer's training hadn't prepared her to handle. Sarah complied immediately, setting her Glock on the counter with movements that demonstrated her familiarity with law enforcement protocols. "Former Staff Sergeant Sarah Chen, retired military," she announced, providing the information that would help Walsh understand the situation. "I have a concealed carry permit in my purse, along with my military identification." Murphy moved carefully toward the wounded criminal, checking to ensure that all weapons were secured before any additional threats could develop. The restaurant owner's military training was evident in his systematic approach to clearing the scene, though his movements were slower and more cautious than they would have been 30 years earlier. The wiry criminal near the kitchen door was unconscious but breathing, Sarah's shot having incapacitated him without causing immediately life-threatening injuries. The precision required for such shooting was extraordinary, demanding not only exceptional marksmanship but also detailed knowledge of human anatomy and ballistics. Sarah's capabilities were becoming more apparent with each detail that emerged from the engagement. Jake approached the leader's motionless form with obvious reluctance, his civilian mind recoiling from the reality of violent death. The young server had never seen a dead body before, let alone witness someone being killed in front of him. His pale complexion and unsteady movements indicated the onset of shock as his brain struggled to process the trauma he had experienced. "He's gone," Jake whispered, though everyone in the diner had already reached the same conclusion. The leader's body lay in an unnatural position that left no doubt about his condition, Sarah's shot having been placed with lethal precision. The criminal who had terrorized them moments earlier was no longer a threat to anyone. Amy finally found her voice again, though it came out as barely more than a whisper. "Who are you?" she asked, staring at Sarah with a mixture of gratitude and fear. The question echoed what everyone in the diner was thinking as they tried to reconcile the grandmother figure they thought they knew with the deadly operative she had revealed herself to be. Sarah's response was simple but loaded with implications. Someone who couldn't stand by and watch innocent people get hurt. The answer revealed nothing about her specific background while explaining everything about her motivations. She had acted not from professional obligation but from personal conviction, the same principles that had guided her throughout her military career. Officer Walsh holstered her weapon as she processed Sarah's identification, her police radio crackling to life as she called for backup and medical assistance. The young policewoman's voice was steady despite the trauma she had experienced, her professional training asserting itself as she took control of the crime scene that Sarah had created through her intervention. The sound of approaching sirens grew louder as additional law enforcement and emergency medical personnel responded to Walsh's call for assistance. The quiet diner that had been transformed into a battleground would soon be filled with investigators, paramedics and curious onlookers drawn by the drama that had unfolded in their peaceful community. Murphy retrieved a clean towel from behind the counter and pressed it against his head wound, his movements automatic despite the shock of what he had witnessed. The restaurant owner looked at Sarah with something approaching reverence, understanding that she had saved not only his life but the lives of everyone else in the diner. The debt was one that could never be properly repaid. Sarah remained alert despite the apparent resolution of the immediate threat, her training demanding continued vigilance until law enforcement had completely secured the scene. The habits developed through decades of military service were not easily abandoned, and her body maintained the readiness posture that had kept her alive in combat zones around the world. The wounded criminal's groaning grew louder as shock began to wear off and pain asserted itself, his attempts to move resulting in fresh bleeding from his shoulder wound.
Sarah watched him with professional detachment, ensuring that he remained incapacitated while monitoring his condition for signs of medical emergency that might require immediate intervention. Derek helped Amy to her feet, both young people moving with the unsteady gait of survivors trying to process their escape from certain death. The couple's relief was mixed with lingering terror as they struggled to understand how quickly their peaceful breakfast had transformed into a life-threatening situation and back again. The first police cruiser pulled into the parking lot with lights flashing, followed quickly by an ambulance and additional law enforcement vehicles. The emergency response was swift and professional, though the responders had no idea what they would find inside the diner that had become the scene of a precisely executed counter-operation. Jake slumped against the wall behind the counter, his legs finally giving out as the adrenaline that had sustained him through the crisis began to fade. The young server's hands shook uncontrollably as his nervous system struggled to process the trauma he had experienced, his civilian mind overwhelmed by exposure to violence that military personnel trained for years to handle. Sarah noted the approaching law enforcement with satisfaction, knowing that her part in the drama was essentially complete. The wounded criminal would be questioned, the scene would be processed, and the investigation would reveal whatever network had planned and supported the robbery. Her intervention had not only saved lives but had also preserved evidence that would help prevent future crimes. Officer Walsh moved efficiently through the diner, securing weapons and beginning the preliminary documentation that would form the foundation of the criminal case. The young policewoman's composure was impressive given her inexperience with violent crime, her police academy training serving her well in the aftermath of the shooting.
The questions would come later, Sarah knew. Investigators would want detailed statements about the engagement, explanations of her background and capabilities, justifications for her use of lethal force. The bureaucratic aftermath of violent action was always complex, requiring patience and cooperation with authorities who needed to understand exactly what had happened and why. Murphy looked around his diner with something approaching disbelief, the familiar space transformed by the violence that had erupted within its walls. The restaurant owner would need time to process what had occurred, to understand how close he and his people had come to dying before Sarah's intervention had changed everything. The heavy-set criminal's breathing became more labored as blood loss began to affect his condition, prompting Sarah to alert Officer Walsh to the need for immediate medical attention. The wounded man's survival was important for the investigation, and Sarah's first aid training from her military service allowed her to assess his condition accurately. Paramedics burst through the front door with equipment and urgent efficiency, their arrival marking the beginning of the professional response that would restore order to the chaos Sarah had created through her defensive action. The medical personnel moved with practiced skill, immediately assessing the wounded criminal's condition while preparing to treat the other victims of the morning's violence. Sarah stepped back from the scene as law enforcement and medical personnel took control, her role as protector transitioning to that of witness and cooperating citizen. The transformation back to civilian status was as complete as her earlier change to combat operative, though the morning's events had made it clear that retirement had not diminished her capabilities or her willingness to use them when necessary. The investigation that would follow would reveal the full scope of the criminal enterprise that had targeted Murphy's diner, uncovering connections and conspiracies that stretched far beyond the three men who had walked through the front door that morning. Sarah's intervention had not only saved lives but had also disrupted a criminal network that would have continued threatening innocent people throughout the region. As the diner filled with investigators and emergency personnel, Sarah Chen settled back into her corner booth and calmly waited to give her statement, knowing that her 3 years of peaceful retirement had ended forever, but satisfied that the skills she had hoped never to use again had served their purpose when innocent lives hung in the balance. 6 months later, Sarah Chen stood behind the podium at the Millbrook Community Center, facing an audience of local law enforcement officers who had gathered for her presentation on civilian preparedness and threat recognition. The modest woman who had once hidden her military background now found herself reluctantly thrust into the spotlight as the town's unexpected hero, though she maintained the same quiet dignity that had characterized her 3 years of anonymous retirement. Detective Marcus Rodriguez, the lead investigator on the diner case, had spent weeks piecing together Sarah's military record after obtaining the necessary clearances from federal authorities. What he discovered explained everything about her extraordinary performance that morning, while raising new questions about the kind of operations she had conducted during her decades of service in places that remained classified even in retirement. The investigation into the criminal network had revealed connections stretching across 3 states, with the diner robbery being just one operation in a series of carefully planned heists targeting small businesses in rural communities. Sarah's intervention had not only saved the lives of everyone present that morning, but had also disrupted a sophisticated criminal enterprise that had been responsible for dozens of similar crimes over the previous 2 years. Murphy's Diner had reopened within a week of the incident, though the atmosphere remained changed by the events that had transformed the peaceful breakfast spot into a crime scene. The restaurant owner had installed additional security measures and modified the layout to provide better sightlines, changes that reflected his military mindset and newfound understanding of the vulnerabilities that existed in seemingly safe spaces. Jake had struggled with post-traumatic stress following his exposure to violence, requiring counseling and time away from work to process the trauma he had experienced. The young server's recovery had been gradual but steady, aided by the knowledge that he had witnessed something extraordinary rather than simply surviving a random act of violence. His respect for Sarah bordered on reverence, though she had gently discouraged his attempts to treat her as anything more than a neighbor who had acted when action was necessary. Officer Jennifer Walsh had been promoted to detective following her professional handling of the crime scene and subsequent investigation, her career trajectory altered by her association with a case that had drawn attention from federal law enforcement agencies. The young policewoman had developed a friendship with Sarah based on mutual respect and shared understanding of the burdens that came with the responsibility to protect others. Amy and Derek had married 6 months ahead of their original schedule, the near-death experience accelerating their commitment to each other while providing perspective on what truly mattered in their young lives. The couple visited Sarah regularly, bringing small gifts and expressions of gratitude that she accepted graciously while deflecting their attempts to make her into something larger than life. The wounded criminal had survived his injuries and provided extensive cooperation with federal investigators, his testimony revealing details about criminal networks that stretched far beyond the original diner robbery. His information had led to dozens of arrests and the disruption of multiple ongoing criminal enterprises, making Sarah's decision to preserve his life strategically valuable as well as morally justified. Sarah's transition back to civilian life had been complicated by the media attention that followed the revelation of her military background and the extraordinary nature of her intervention at the diner. Reporters from regional and national news outlets had descended on Millbrook, seeking interviews and human interest stories about the grandmother who had turned out to be a deadly operative with decades of classified experience. The attention was unwelcome but manageable, Sarah's military training providing her with the discipline necessary to maintain her privacy while cooperating with legitimate law enforcement inquiries. She had given one interview to the local newspaper, carefully controlling the narrative while providing enough information to satisfy public curiosity without compromising operational security or revealing details about her classified service record. The presentation Sarah was delivering focused on practical security awareness for civilian business owners, sharing insights gained from her military experience without revealing specific techniques or classified information. Her audience of police officers and business leaders listened with rapt attention, understanding that they were receiving instruction from someone whose expertise had been proven under the most demanding circumstances possible. Detective Rodriguez had become something of a protege, seeking Sarah's input on complex cases that required the kind of tactical thinking that had been absent from local law enforcement before her arrival in Millbrook. The veteran investigator's respect for Sarah's abilities had evolved into genuine friendship, built on their shared understanding of the challenges faced by those who dedicated their lives to protecting others. The federal agents who had reviewed Sarah's case had been impressed by the precision and restraint she had demonstrated during the diner engagement, qualities that reflected extensive training and experience in similar situations. Their investigation had confirmed that her actions were entirely justified under both state and federal law, though they had also noted that her capabilities exceeded those of typical retired military personnel. Murphy had become one of Sarah's closest friends in Millbrook, their shared military background creating a bond that transcended their age difference and different service eras. The restaurant owner understood better than anyone else what Sarah had sacrificed to save their lives that morning, recognizing the psychological cost of returning to violence after years of peaceful retirement. The display case in Murphy's Diner now contained a small memorial to the morning's events, including newspaper clippings about the investigation and a photo of Sarah receiving a civilian commendation from the mayor. The tribute was tasteful and understated, reflecting both the gravity of what had occurred and the community's gratitude for Sarah's actions. Sarah's daily routine had gradually returned to something approaching normalcy, though she remained more alert to her surroundings than she had been during her initial retirement years. The morning coffee at Murphy's continued but now included conversations with neighbors who had gained new appreciation for the quiet woman they had barely noticed before the incident that revealed her true nature. The local gun range had experienced a surge in membership following the diner incident, as residents sought to develop their own defensive capabilities after witnessing what proper training could accomplish. Sarah had been asked to provide instruction but had politely declined, preferring to maintain her privacy while supporting the community's interest in self-defense through other means. The criminal justice system had processed the surviving members of the network with unusual efficiency, aided by the comprehensive evidence that Sarah's intervention had preserved and the cooperation of witnesses who had observed the entire sequence of events. The prosecutions had resulted in lengthy sentences that reflected both the severity of the crimes and the potential for violence that had been demonstrated through the criminals' actions. Sarah's mailbox had filled with letters from across the country, messages from military veterans who recognized a fellow warrior, and from civilians who drew inspiration from her example of preparedness and courage. She had answered each letter personally, offering encouragement while deflecting attempts to transform her into a symbol or spokesperson for various causes. The psychological evaluation that Sarah had undergone as part of the investigation had confirmed what those who knew her had already understood. She was a fundamentally decent person who had been shaped by extraordinary circumstances and training into someone capable of extraordinary actions when necessity demanded them. The evaluator's report had noted her remarkable emotional stability and clear moral compass, qualities that explained her ability to use lethal force judiciously rather than indiscriminately. The town of Millbrook had changed in subtle ways following the diner incident, residents displaying greater awareness of their surroundings and increased appreciation for the law enforcement officers who protected their community. The event had served as a reminder that danger could appear anywhere, but also that ordinary people could rise to meet extraordinary challenges when properly prepared and motivated. Sarah's house on Elm Street remained modest and unremarkable from the outside, though she had made discreet security improvements that reflected her professional training and heightened awareness of potential threats. The changes were invisible to casual observers but would provide significant advantages if she ever again found herself targeted by those who wished her harm. The friendship between Sarah and Officer Walsh had deepened over the months following the incident, the younger woman seeking guidance and mentorship from someone whose experience dwarfed her own. Their conversations covered everything from tactical considerations to the psychological challenges of using force to protect others, topics that few people could understand or discuss knowledgeably. Murphy's breakfast crowd had grown larger following the publicity surrounding the diner incident, though the atmosphere remained respectful rather than sensational. Visitors came seeking to see the place where extraordinary events had unfolded, but they found a normal restaurant run by decent people who had survived something terrible and emerged stronger for the experience. The investigation's final report had classified Sarah's actions as a textbook example of appropriate use of force by a trained civilian, her precision and restraint serving as a model for law enforcement training programs. The document had been distributed to police academies and military training facilities, ensuring that her example would influence future generations of those tasked with protecting others. Sarah's retirement had been permanently altered by the events of that morning, but she had found a new sense of purpose in her role as an unofficial advisor to local law enforcement and a quiet guardian of her adopted community. The peaceful life she had sought was no longer possible, but the meaningful life she had found was perhaps more valuable than the anonymity she had originally desired. The memorial service for the criminal who had died during the engagement had been attended by no one except the funeral home staff and a minister who had never met him, a stark reminder of the isolation that accompanied a life dedicated to preying upon others. Sarah had not attended, but she had paid for a simple headstone that bore only his name and dates, a gesture of respect for human dignity that transcended the circumstances of his death. The training Sarah provided to local business owners and community groups focused on situational awareness and basic security measures, rather than combat techniques, her goal being to help ordinary people avoid dangerous situations rather than prepare them to fight their way out of them. The approach reflected her understanding that prevention was always preferable to violent resolution. The federal investigators who had studied the case had quietly recommended Sarah for a Civilian Medal of Honor, though she had declined the recognition in favor of maintaining her privacy. The gesture had been appreciated even though the award was never formally presented, representing official acknowledgement of her extraordinary service to her community and country. Detective Rodriguez often sought Sarah's perspective on complex cases, her analytical abilities and tactical experience providing insights that complemented his investigative skills. Their collaboration had resulted in several successful prosecutions and had elevated the quality of law enforcement in Millbrook to levels that exceeded what would normally be expected in a small community. The story of the morning at Murphy's Diner had become part of local folklore,
told and retold with varying degrees of accuracy and embellishment. Sarah herself remained the most reliable source of information about what had actually occurred, though she spoke about it rarely and only when necessary to correct particularly egregious distortions of the facts. The courage that Sarah had displayed was not the reckless bravery of someone acting on impulse, but the calculated valor of a professional who understood the risks and accepted them because the alternative was unacceptable. Her example had inspired others in Millbrook to consider their own responsibilities to their neighbors and community, creating a culture of mutual support and vigilance. As Sarah concluded her presentation to the assembled law enforcement officers, she reflected on the unexpected trajectory that her retirement had taken. The quiet anonymity she had sought was gone forever, but in its place she had found something equally valuable, a community that appreciated her service in a role that allowed her to continue protecting others without the overseas deployments and classified missions that had defined her military career. The applause that followed her presentation was respectful rather than enthusiastic, the audience understanding that they had received instruction from someone whose expertise had been earned through decades of service in situations they could barely imagine. Sarah acknowledged their appreciation with a slight nod, then stepped away from the podium and back into the civilian life that would never again be quite as simple as she had originally hoped, but which had proven to be more meaningful than she had ever expected. 2 years after the incident that changed everything, Sarah Chen received a phone call that would once again alter the trajectory of her carefully reconstructed civilian life. The voice on the other end belonged to Colonel Patricia Hayes, her former commanding officer, speaking with the crisp authority that Sarah remembered from her active duty years in classified operations across 3 continents. "Sarah, we need to talk. There's a situation developing that requires your particular expertise." The colonel's words carried weight that transcended normal requests for assistance, indicating something far more serious than the community safety presentations and local law enforcement consultations that had occupied Sarah's time since the diner incident became public knowledge. The secure meeting took place at a nondescript office building 2 hours outside Millbrook, in a facility that bore no identifying marks but radiated the subtle signs of federal government operation. Sarah recognized the type of place immediately, having attended countless briefings in similar locations during her active service career. The familiar atmosphere brought back memories of missions that remained classified decades after their completion. Colonel Hayes looked older than Sarah remembered, the intervening years having added gray to her hair and lines to her face that spoke of continued service in demanding positions. The officer's bearing remained as impressive as ever, though projecting the kind of natural authority that came from leading others through situations where mistakes had fatal consequences for both military personnel and innocent civilians. "The situation is delicate," Hayes began, sliding a classified folder across the conference table. "We have intelligence indicating that elements of the network you disrupted at the diner were part of something much larger. International connections, sophisticated financing, and objectives that extend far beyond simple robbery operations." Sarah opened the folder with the practiced ease of someone accustomed to handling sensitive information, her eyes quickly scanning photographs, intelligence reports, and tactical assessments that painted a disturbing picture. The criminal organization had tentacles reaching across multiple countries, with the domestic operations serving as funding mechanisms for activities that threatened national security interests. The briefing materials revealed that the 3 men who had attempted to rob Murphy's Diner were small-time operatives in a network that included former military and intelligence personnel from several nations. Their robbery spree had been designed to generate untraceable funding for operations that remained unclear but appeared to involve weapons trafficking and possible terrorist activities. "The surviving member you captured has provided extensive intelligence, but we've reached the limits of what traditional interrogation and investigation can accomplish," Hayes continued. "The network has gone underground, adapting their methods and relocating their operations in response to our disruption of their domestic funding sources." Sarah studied the documents with growing understanding of why her former commanding officer had sought her out. The situation required someone with her specific combination of skills: tactical expertise, operational experience, and the kind of analytical thinking that had made her effective in complex environments where conventional approaches had failed to achieve results. "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Sarah's question was direct, though she suspected she already knew the answer. The materials in the folder were building toward a request that would take her far from the quiet life she had built in Millbrook, back into the world of classified operations and calculated violence that she had left behind. Hayes leaned forward, her expression serious. We need someone to infiltrate what remains of the network. Someone they wouldn't suspect, someone with the skills to gather intelligence and, if necessary, neutralize key targets. Your profile is perfect, a retired operative living quietly in a small town, someone who appears to have left her military identity behind.
The irony was not lost on Sarah that her very attempt to blend into civilian life had created the perfect cover for returning to active operations. The 3 years of careful anonymity followed by 2 years of reluctant local prominence had established a public identity that would provide excellent camouflage for covert activities. The mission parameters were complex and dangerous, requiring Sarah to assume a new identity and embed herself within criminal networks that had already demonstrated their willingness to use extreme violence against anyone who threatened their operations. The work would be similar to operations she had conducted during her active service, but with the added complication of operating without official backup or support. "I'll need complete operational autonomy," Sarah stated, her mind already beginning to work through the tactical challenges involved. No oversight, no check-ins, no predetermined timelines. This kind of infiltration requires flexibility that micromanagement would compromise. Hayes nodded, having expected such conditions from someone of Sarah's experience and reputation. "You'll have whatever resources you need and complete authority to conduct operations as you see fit. The only requirement is results. We need to understand the full scope of this network and eliminate its ability to threaten American interests." Sarah spent the next hour reviewing detailed intelligence reports that filled in the gaps in her understanding of the criminal organization she had unknowingly engaged 2 years earlier. The network's sophistication was impressive, incorporating advanced surveillance technology, encrypted communications, and operational security measures that rivaled those used by legitimate intelligence agencies. The financial trail revealed connections to offshore banking systems, cryptocurrency operations, and legitimate businesses that served as fronts for illegal activities. The network's international reach included cells operating across Europe, Southeast Asia, and Central America, with the American operations serving as both a source of funding and a recruitment ground for specialized personnel. The personnel files were particularly concerning, showing that the network had successfully recruited former military and intelligence operatives from multiple countries, including some whose backgrounds suggested access to classified information and advanced training. The combination of criminal motivation with professional capabilities created a threat that traditional law enforcement agencies were ill-equipped to handle. "The timeline is critical," Hayes emphasized. "Intelligence suggests they're planning something significant within the next 6 months. We don't know what, but the financial flows and personnel movements indicate a major operation in the planning stages." Sarah's acceptance of the mission was never really in question, though she took time to consider the implications for her life in Millbrook and the relationships she had built over the past 5 years. The community that had embraced her after the diner incident would have to be left behind, at least temporarily, while she returned to the shadows that had defined her active military career. The cover identity that the intelligence community created for Sarah was masterful in its simplicity. She would become Elena Rodriguez, a recently widowed woman with a background in security consulting seeking to rebuild her life after personal tragedy. The identity provided explanations for her skills and resources while creating a sympathetic persona that would facilitate social connections within criminal networks. The transformation from Sarah Chen to Elena Rodriguez required not only changes in appearance and documentation but also psychological adjustments that allowed her to inhabit the new identity completely. Sarah's decades of experience with covert operations served her well in this process, her ability to become someone else entirely being one of the skills that had made her so effective in classified missions. The safe house where Sarah prepared for her mission was located in a major city hundreds of miles from Millbrook, equipped with everything necessary to support a long-term covert operation. The facility included sophisticated communications equipment, weapons and equipment caches, and secure workspace for analyzing intelligence and planning operations. Sarah's preparation involved intensive study of the target network's known operations, personnel, and methods, combined with physical training to ensure her combat skills remained at their peak effectiveness. The work was familiar from her active duty years, though the stakes felt different now that she was operating as a volunteer rather than under military orders. The first phase of the mission required establishing Elena Rodriguez's credibility within criminal circles that might lead to contact with the target network. Sarah's approach was patient and methodical, using her genuine skills in security consulting to build a reputation that would attract the attention of those seeking professional expertise for illegal activities. The criminal underworld she entered was more sophisticated than most law enforcement agencies realized, incorporating advanced technology and professional practices that rivaled legitimate businesses. The networks operated with careful attention to security and compartmentalization, making infiltration challenging even for someone with Sarah's extensive experience. Sarah's initial contacts were established through carefully orchestrated encounters that appeared accidental but were actually the result of detailed planning and intelligence gathering. Her Elena Rodriguez persona proved effective at generating interest from criminal elements who were constantly seeking qualified personnel for increasingly complex operations. The process of gaining trust within criminal networks required Sarah to demonstrate her capabilities through gradually escalating activities, beginning with consulting work and progressing toward direct involvement in illegal operations. Each step carried risks that had to be carefully managed to avoid exposure while building the credibility necessary for deeper infiltration. The intelligence Sarah gathered during her first month of operation confirmed the briefing material's assessment of the network's sophistication and international reach. Her reports to Colonel Hayes revealed connections between seemingly unrelated criminal activities across multiple continents, painting a picture of an organization that operated more like a private intelligence service than a traditional criminal enterprise. Sarah's cover identity had successfully attracted attention from mid-level operatives within the target network, though gaining access to senior leadership would require additional time and demonstrated value to the organization. The patience required for deep cover operations was something Sarah had learned through experience, understanding that rushing the process would likely result in exposure and mission failure. The psychological challenge of inhabiting Elena Rodriguez's identity while maintaining her essential sense of self was considerable, requiring Sarah to draw upon mental disciplines developed during her most demanding military assignments. The ability to maintain operational focus while living a constructed identity was one of the most difficult aspects of covert work. 3 months into the mission, Sarah's persistence was rewarded with an invitation to participate in a significant operation that would provide access to senior network personnel and detailed knowledge of their planning processes. The opportunity represented a breakthrough in the investigation but also carried enormous risks if her true identity was discovered. The operation Sarah was invited to join involved sophisticated financial crimes targeting multiple institutions simultaneously, demonstrating the network's coordination and technical capabilities. Her role would be to provide security consulting and personnel screening, work that played directly to her genuine expertise while positioning her to observe the organization's methods and personnel. Sarah's preparation for the operation required careful balance between demonstrating competence and avoiding actions that might raise suspicions about her true background and motivations. The challenge of appearing professional while concealing the full extent of her capabilities was familiar from previous covert assignments but remained demanding even with her extensive experience. The mission that had begun as a response to events at a small-town diner was evolving into something far more complex and consequential, with implications that extended well beyond the original criminal network. Sarah found herself once again at the center of events that would determine whether dangerous enemies of American interests could be stopped before they achieved objectives that remained hidden but were certainly destructive in nature. As Sarah prepared to embed herself deeper within the criminal organization, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from peaceful retirement to the edge of another classified mission. The skills that had defined her military career were proving their continued relevance in a world where threats to national security came from sources that traditional military and law enforcement agencies struggled to understand and counter effectively. The warehouse in Prague erupted into chaos as Sarah's cover was blown during what should have been the final intelligence-gathering operation. Elena Rodriguez's carefully constructed identity crumbled when a former CIA operative within the criminal network recognized her from classified files he had stolen years earlier during his own fall from grace. Sarah moved with lethal precision through the maze of shipping containers and industrial equipment, her suppressed pistol eliminating threats with surgical accuracy while she fought her way toward the primary objective. The network's leadership had gathered for a planning session that would have revealed the full scope of their international operations, but now they were scattering like roaches exposed to sudden light. Viktor Kozlov, the network's mastermind, stood his ground in the warehouse's main office as his subordinates fled or died around him. The former Spetsnaz colonel had built his criminal empire through careful planning and ruthless execution, but he had underestimated the woman who had infiltrated his organization with such devastating effectiveness. "You destroyed everything I built," Kozlov snarled, his weapon trained on Sarah as she approached his position. "One old woman in a diner started a chain reaction that cost me millions and exposed operations that took decades to establish." Sarah's response was calm and measured, her own weapon steady despite the adrenaline coursing through her system. "You made the mistake of threatening innocent people. That was always going to end badly for you." The philosophical difference between them was absolute. He saw civilians as resources to be exploited while she saw them as people deserving protection. The final confrontation lasted only seconds, Sarah's superior training and tactical positioning allowing her to end Kozlov's threat permanently while securing the intelligence materials he had been attempting to destroy. The data storage devices she recovered contained comprehensive records of the network's operations, financial structures, and planned attacks across 3 continents. Colonel Hayes's voice crackled through Sarah's encrypted communicator as emergency extraction protocols activated around the compromised warehouse. "Package secured, Lazarus. Your ride home is inbound." The code name from Sarah's active duty years felt appropriate for someone who had returned from the quiet death of retirement to complete one final mission. The helicopter that lifted Sarah from the Prague warehouse carried her toward a debriefing facility where intelligence analysts would spend months unraveling the network she had destroyed through 18 months of patient infiltration. Her mission had prevented attacks that could have killed thousands while dismantling a criminal organization that had operated with impunity for over a decade. 3 weeks later, Sarah Chen walked through the front door of Murphy's Diner for the first time in almost 2 years, her appearance subtly altered by the experiences and modifications that had been necessary for deep cover operations. The familiar sounds and smells of the restaurant brought back memories of the morning that had changed everything, when 3 criminals had discovered that threats to innocent people would always find resistance from unexpected sources. Murphy looked up from his grill with a smile that held both welcome and questions he was wise enough not to ask. "Coffee's fresh," he said simply, understanding that some explanations were better left unspoken. The restaurant owner's military background gave him insight into the kind of absences that couldn't be discussed but deserved respect. Jake approached with the nervous energy that had characterized him since the original diner incident, though his trauma had been replaced by genuine admiration for the woman who had saved his life twice without him ever knowing about the second time. His survival of both the original robbery and the international conspiracy that had targeted the diner made him unknowingly one of the luckiest people alive. Officer Walsh, now Detective Walsh, looked up from her coffee with the knowing expression of someone who had learned to recognize classified operations and their aftermath. "Welcome home, Sarah. The town missed you." Her words carried understanding that went beyond civilian comprehension of extended absences. Amy and Derek, now married and expecting their first child, waved from their usual booth near the window where they had nearly died years earlier. Their survival had led to a life filled with appreciation for simple moments in ordinary days, gifts they never would have recognized without experiencing how quickly everything could change. Sarah settled into her corner booth with a cup of coffee and yesterday's newspaper, resuming the routine that had been interrupted by duty but never truly abandoned. The quiet retirement she had originally sought was no longer possible, but the purposeful life she had found was more valuable than anonymity had ever been. The secure phone in her purse remained silent, its encrypted channels carrying no new requests for assistance from agencies that had learned to value her unique combination of skills and principles. Sarah hoped it would remain quiet, but she had accepted that some kinds of service never truly ended for those capable of providing them. Detective Rodriguez stopped by during his morning patrol, offering a respectful nod to the woman who had become his unofficial mentor in tactical thinking and threat assessment. Their professional relationship had evolved into genuine friendship built on shared understanding of the burdens carried by those who protected others. The memorial display case still held its place of honor near the diner's entrance, containing newspaper clippings about the original incident alongside a new edition, a simple plaque recognizing Sarah's continued service to the community and country. The tribute was understated but meaningful, acknowledging contributions that could never be fully disclosed. Murphy refilled Sarah's coffee cup with the practiced ease of someone who had maintained routines through extraordinary circumstances. "Everything back to normal now?" he asked, though his tone suggested he understood that normal was a relative concept for people like them. Sarah's smile held the quiet satisfaction of someone who had completed necessary work while protecting innocent people from threats they would never know existed. As normal as it gets, she replied, understanding that her definition of normal included readiness for whatever challenges might emerge from the shadows. The morning crowd gradually filled Murphy's diner with the comfortable noise of a community going about its daily business, unaware that their peaceful existence had been protected by actions taken in distant places by one of their own. Sarah Chen had learned that retirement was not the absence of purpose but the freedom to choose which purposes deserved her commitment. The phone in her purse remained silent, but Sarah knew that silence was temporary for someone with her capabilities and moral compass. When duty called again, she would answer, because some people were simply built to stand between predators and their prey, regardless of age, retirement status, or personal preferences for quiet lives. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up, just click and check them out.